All right. So that one's going to churn along. It's going to create that image. That's one example of a DMG. I'm creating a DMG file of this computer. Now, what can I do with that DMG? Well, the short answer is not a whole lot. So I can't really restore it, because if I restore it, it's not bootable. I could restore it, but then I have to take extra steps to make that system bootable. So in the Mac world, a bootable partition is called blessed. A blessed partition is one that has the proper entries for the bootloader that's allowed to fire up and function. We'll see that if I were to restore this, it's not blessed. And so I'd have to go that extra step. Well, we're going to see that in another episode when we start talking about deploying these things. But for right now, just know that this one won't be, so it's not really bootable. But I could use it to recover files, right? I've got a snapshot of this machine at a certain point in time, and it'll be a DMG. I could mount that DMG on any Mac here in the building and browse into it and get files out of it. I basically got a portable time machine backup. Right? It's a backup of this computer that I can then send wherever and have access to those files. So that's really the utility for it as far as imaging a system. But normally we're doing it for software, right? I just want to distribute some software, and that's what I'm going to use, and so I need to be able to package those together. Well, if we want to do software, you need to create a DMG that's not based on a disk, but it's basically just a container in and of itself. And when you do that, you've got to be really careful, because DMGs by default have a fixed size. So when I make a DMG, I have to tell it what size I want it to be. I can tell it, hey, I want it to be 100 megabytes in size. And when I do that, it'll make a 100 megabyte file. Even if the file is completely empty, it will still be 100 megabytes. The DMG contains a bit-for-bit replica of whatever data it is you're putting in there, including empty bits. So when I create my own DMGs, I've got to pick between doing a traditional fixed DMG, that's just the normal one, or what's called a sparse disk image. And a sparse disk image is where it says if there's empty blocks, don't bother putting those in there, right? Like, why have blocks that represent something empty and just leave those out? And so now if I create a 100 megabyte DMG file and I don't put anything in it, it'll be significantly smaller. And as I put data in there, the file will grow and grow and grow to match that. Okay, so I want to show you guys an example of that so you can see it. It's important to remember for the exam. And my disk image of that Mac Mini just finished. I can see right here, operation successful. It finished imaging that system. It took 2.5 minutes. And I can see here my file size. I saw back here in my disk manager that we were using 13.88 gigs, but my disk image is only 7.5 gigs, and that's because it compressed it down, and I don't have to worry about that disk being a terabyte when mine isn't. All right. And if I look on my desktop, I've got my Mac Mini image.dmg, that's what I just made, and if I pull up its information, it's 7.5 gigs, right? There's that DMG, and I can mount it and browse into it and see all the files that were on that Mac Mini. I've now got a copy of it. All right. So let's take a look at creating a DMG from scratch, right? So if I come in here to my Macintosh hard drive and I want to distribute iBooks. I think that was the example I gave what feels like forever ago now. And I'm going to go up here to File, New Image, and I'm going to create a blank image. All right? We're just going to make a blank one, and I'll put the data in there myself. Now when I go to create it, I need to give it a name, and so maybe I'll say this is iBooks version, well here, I need to give it a file name. So we'll just say like iBooks version 1.2. I don't know what version iBooks is on right now, so I'll just say version 1.2. All right. I'm going to save it to my desktop, and I'll give it a nice name. Now, the save as, that's the file name. The name here is the name that'll show up on the desktop when it's mounted. So it's nice to give it a pretty name here. So I'll say this is like iBooks version 1.2. And I'm going to make it 100 megabytes, just like I said a minute ago, right? So just 100 megs. It's going to be formatted OS X extended, right? It's like a regular hard drive. You got to format it. And so I could choose to go like exFAT or whatever, but we typically want the OS X extended. And then down here at the bottom, I can pick the image format. And the default is a read-write disk image. That's the normal mode that we want. And if I do that, I'm telling it to create a 100 meg file. It's going to be 100 megs. That's what it's going to create. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save, and it's going to create that one. All right. The larger the DMG you created, the longer it'll take to create. Mine's only 100 megs, so it'll create really fast. I'm going to do another one. So I'm just going to go back to New Image, Blank Image. And let's call this one iBooks version 1.3, right? So this will be another file, except this time, instead of doing the standard read-write disk image, I'm going to change that. And you'll see we've got a few other options in here, including the sparse disk image that I mentioned earlier. A sparse disk image is just like the DMG, except it leaves out the empty stuff. Why make a file that contains empty stuff? We can just leave that stuff out. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do that, and I'll hit save. And so now I've created 2 of these files. And if I look on my desktop, they're, where do those things end up? They're way over here. There we go. I can see I created these 2 files, and I guess my head's kind of sitting on top of those. But I can see those 2 files. I got iBooks version 1.2.dmg and iBooks version 1.3.sparseImage. Right? So it's actually calling out the fact that it is a sparse image and not a traditional DMG. It's a little bit different. And I can double click on those guys to mount them, so that's what I'm going to do. So I'll mount the first one, and then I'll mount the second one, which apparently it's going to take its time for. I'm guessing because I still have that window open. There we go. And so now I've got those 2 guys mounted right here, right? And see how it's that friendly name that I typed in? That's why we have 2 names, the file name and then the friendly name, so that I can see those. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take iBooks, and if I look at iBooks, how big is it? It's 51 megs in size, right? So 62.9 megs on disk, but 51 megs in size of the actual file. And I'm going to send a copy of it to my version 1.2, and I'll send a copy of it to version 1.3. So I'm just going to copy it to those guys. All right. And if I browse into them, here's iBooks version 1.2, and I can see iBooks is right there. And iBooks version 1.3, I can see it's got the file too, right? So both disks now contain that. And if I go back up to my desktop and I look at the details of these files, what I can see is the size. And if you look, iBooks version 1.2 is exactly 100 megabytes. A DMG will be a fixed size, even the empty space by default. But the sparse image, 37.8, right? Not only did it make an image of the file, it compressed it too. And it left out the empty space. It ends up being pretty small. Okay? And at the end of the day, the sparse image is a DMG. I can rename it to a .dmg and it'll work just fine. And that's what you'd normally do before you distribute it. Nobody distributes a sparse image. They distribute a DMG, right? So you can just rename that and then you're in business. They work the same once they're created. But that is important. So on the exam, you'll see that difference between a sparse disk image and a regular read-write disk image. Regular read-write has a fixed size whether you put data in it or not. Right? Once you've got these created, they can be distributed however you want, right? So if I go down here, I need to eject them before I mess around with them. So I'm just going to eject those 2 virtual disks, and we'll give that a second while it gets rid of them. And then once they're gone, like I said, I can rename that version 1.3 file eventually. Wow, mine apparently really likes those files. There we go. So I can take that version 1.3 file, and I'm just going to rename it so it's a DMG. And we'll do that. There we go. And now I've effectively got 2 files that I can distribute out and people can use and be happy with, and the world is a safer place, right? So this is what you're getting when you download software from vendors that are distributing these DMG files.